So hello everybody. I will continue here on the lecture about international migration, and now we focus on the topic related to undocumented immigration. So let's just go to slide 60 where we start on this topic. So international migrants are often categorized as either being documented or undocumented. And the undocumented, also known as unauthorized immigrant, is a person who immigrates into a host country through irregular or extra-legal channels. And there are basically two types of unauthorized immigrants. The ones that enter without inspections, known as EWIs, and visa overstayers or visa overstays. So entries without inspection, it's pretty much like during the process of migrating to the host country, the person avoided inspection by crossing borders clandestinely or travel with fraudulent documents. And visa overstayers or visa overstays, it's a migrant overstayed the time limit of a legally obtained non-immigrant temporary visa. So usually these are the migrants that enter a specific country with a visa, a temporary visa, like a tourist visa, but then these people stay longer than the allowed time that they're supposed to, that they can stay with the tourist visa. So for example, in the US, with the tourist visa, people can usually stay between 3 and 6 months in the US, and visa overstayers are those migrants who stay longer than the amount of time that is allowed in their temporary visa and their tourist visa. And here, from articles from outside of the textbook, I want to give you some idea of how immigrants have been shaping the US throughout history or in these more recent decades. So millions of foreigners enter the US each day. 4.5 million immigrants were accepted as permanent legal US residents between 1990 and 2005. So this is pretty much an average of almost 1 million people per year entering the US. The recent waves of immigrants have brought greater diversity to the US population. As we mentioned before, Europe was the source of most immigrants throughout our history, and most immigrants now, the more recent immigrants, they come from Latin America and Asia. So used to come from Europe, but now from Latin America and Asia. And the undocumented immigration began to increase in the 1970s. So this graph here shows the levels of legal immigration to the US from 1820 to 2005. And it also shows here which were the major sending regions of immigrants coming to the US. And here the author, they divide this period into these immigration phases of frontier expansion, industrialization, immigration pause, and post-1965 immigration. So you see the number of immigrants in thousands here. It started to increase, and up to around 1880, most of immigrants, or the majority of immigrants, were coming from the Northern and Western Europe. And then afterwards, during the industrialization phase, most of the immigrants came from Southern and Eastern Europe. And then you have a decline in immigration around the 40s, exactly around the time of World War II. And most of the immigrants that arrived during this phase was from Western Europe. And then immigration started to increase again after World War II. And the post-1965 immigration phase, most of the immigrants, they come from Asia and Latin America. And you see this huge increase on legal immigration, which was a result of the Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986, under which 2.7 million undocumented foreigner US residents obtained legal immigration status. So that's why it increased so much, because you had this immigration reform implemented in the country in 1986. And throughout this, here we are focusing on legal immigration. And within this process, exactly because of the effect of specific policies on the level of immigration, it's good to think about like how these policies, they shaped immigration throughout these decades here in the US. So first of all, the Brasileiro program was a temporary labor program that admitted short-term foreign workers in the country. It was created in 1942, expanded in the second half of 1950s, and it was terminated in 1968. And the Brasileiro program pretty much admitted Latin American immigrants, or admitted mostly Mexican immigrants to the country to do some temporary work in the country. They had really low wages, but they would still come here, do some temporary work, and go back to Mexico. And after this program was terminated in 1968, undocumented immigration increased after the Brasileiro program was terminated, not because of an unexpected surge in Mexican migration, but the end of this labor program and limitations on the number of available permanent resident visas made it impossible to accommodate the previously established inflows of migrants. So the Brasileiro program was giving temporary labor opportunities for to the Mexican population. So you'd have a lot of Mexican immigrants coming to the US to do this temporary work. And when it finished in 1968, these flows of Mexicans coming to the US to work here were already established. So, but now they didn't have this program anymore to enter the country documented, even in a temporary basis, to do the work in the US. So they kept coming, but now because this program was terminated, they kept coming as undocumented immigrants. So the increase on undocumented immigrants after 1968, it's not because for an unexpected reason you had an increase in Mexican immigration. The Mexican immigration kept being pretty much the same, but now these people could not come in as temporary workers, but they had to come in as undocumented immigrants. And this graph here kind of summarizes these findings. So here we have Mexican immigration to the US in three categories, pretty much categorizing the immigrants as temporary migrants, illegal immigrants, or the term that we are using here, undocumented immigrants, and legal immigrants. And this is data from 1955 to 1995. So before, when the Brasileiro program still existed, most of the immigrants, they came here temporarily. So they were documented, but they would come here temporarily and work in the US and go back to Mexico. And but that, even before the completely end of the Brasileiro program, the number of temporary migrants under this program were decreasing. And then it was terminated. So these people that used to come here as temporary migrants started coming here as undocumented immigrants. And then in the 70s, in the late 70s, the country imposed some quotas, and then the kind of like the level of undocumented immigration, the level of legal immigration kind of bounced a little bit throughout the years, but was kind of like constant up to the late 80s. And then the IRCA, the immigration reform of 1986 was implemented, and a lot of immigrants that were here undocumented, they gained the legal status. So the overall numbers of undocumented immigrants decreased, and it has been kind of stable. It was stable until around 1995. So it's just interesting to see that pretty much this increase in undocumented immigration after 1968 is not because there was a surge of Mexican immigration to the US, but because before they used to enter here as temporary migrants, documented, the Brasileiro program was terminated, and then they start to enter the country as undocumented immigrants. This graph here shows the unauthorized immigrant population in the US in millions, how it increased from 1990 up to 2007, and then in more recent years has been stable around 11 million people. So this is data from 1990 to 2012. And this is a graph available in the textbook for this course. And this is specifically the unauthorized immigrant population in the US from Mexico. Increased from 1995 to 2007, and then it decreased to around 6 million undocumented immigrants from Mexico in 2012. This table here is really interesting too. It provides the information about foreigners entering the US or gaining residency status between 2003 and 2005 for these different categories. Legal immigrants, and then a lot of different subcategories, legal temporary migrants, and these subcategories, and unauthorized foreigners or undocumented immigrants. And what we see is that overall, the largest numbers here we see under legal temporary migrants, visitors for pleasure, exactly for tourists. But it's important to mention here that these exclude about 150 million admissions annually of certain Canadian tourists and business visitors exempt from visas, along with Mexicans with multiple entry visas or border crossing cards. And more important, these numbers refer to admissions rather than people, which means that many foreigners are counted more than once in these numbers here. But what is interesting to see is that, for example, in 2005, you had more than 23 million people entering the US in 2005 as visitors for pleasure, so tourists with tourist visa. Remember that these numbers here are in thousands, so this means 23 million people here. And the unauthorized immigrants kind of stayed constant over time, so the annual average between 2003 and 2005 was around 525,000 undocumented immigrants entering the country, while those with tourist visa were around 22.2 million immigrants or people entering the country. I mean, and we talked before that tourists are not considered immigrants early in the chapter, so here I just want to be clear that these visitors for pleasure could be tourists that are not immigrants, technically speaking, because they are not permanently moving residents. But as we talked in some previous slides that I just showed you, immigrants, undocumented immigrants, they can be divided in basically in two groups. The ones entering the country without inspection, so they're exactly those guys here, the undocumented immigrants, the EWIs entering without inspection, and the visa overstayers. The visa overstayers can be technically in several of these categories here, but a lot of them are exactly people who enter the country with tourist visa, that technically they are not immigrants, but then they overstay their visa and they stay in the US as in a permanent basis, but without documents. So what's interesting to see is that usually nowadays we see a lot of discourse from politicians and from the media about the need to refrain undocumented immigration. So one of the policies would be to have more security in the southern border, but the security in the southern border would be focusing on these guys here who are undocumented immigrants, and not all of those necessarily coming from the southern border, but most of them are. But most of the undocumented immigrants right now in the US are visa overstayers, and these are these guys here. So a lot of focus from politicians and from the media, from certain media outlets, are focusing here, but most of the undocumented immigrants nowadays, they are visa overstayers that come from these numbers here, which are much higher than this one, 525,000, and here more than 22 million. So here's to give an idea of the status of foreign-born US residents in 2005. Around 31% of them were naturalized US citizens, around 11.5 million. 39% were legal foreign residents, either permanent or temporary. And temporary usually with like student visas to go do undergrad or grad school in the US, for example. And 30% were unauthorized, undocumented immigrants, around 11 million, as I showed in previous graph. So here we are showing these results from this other article, and now I want to show you some studies that have been recently published by Dudley Poston, who is the author of the textbook, but these papers here that he wrote, like this one specific with Peter Morrison, also demographer, related to the proposed southern border wall in the US. So this is some extra reading, and the full papers are referenced at the end of this lecture, and the links to the full articles are also available, to the OPEDs are also available in the course website. So they mentioned that 44 million foreign people are living in the US based on data from 2018. From those, almost 11 million are undocumented immigrants, and out of those 10.7 or almost 11 million undocumented immigrants, we have 4.5 million are visa overstayers, and around 6 million are persons that enter the country without inspections, the EWIs. So overall, EWIs are the majority of the undocumented immigrants now, if we look at the stock, but the recent flows of undocumented immigrants are mostly for people who are overstaying their visas. And Dudley Poston and Peter Morrison discussed that in those articles. And the southern border, as we know, will cost a lot of money to the government, to taxpayers, so over $21.6 billion. And what are the main reasons that these authors are saying that why the southern border will not, the southern border wall will not work? So why will the southern border wall not work? And they point for these three major reasons: because of historical evidence from other countries, because visa overstayers are the majority of the undocumented immigrant flows right now in the country, and because of selectivity of migration. So we'll discuss each one of them. And then we'll also discuss a little bit about that the people who enter without inspections, they don't take jobs from locals. They don't take jobs from US-born population. They are not competing for the same jobs. And the foreign-born people have lower crime rates than the US-born population. So let's just discuss each one of the subtopics here. So in terms of historical evidence, virtually all the famous walls in the world did not or do not work. For example, China's Great Wall took almost 2,000 years to build at a cost of hundreds of thousands of lives, and actually it consists of a series of walls, but it did not keep out foreigners from China. So the Mongols entered China and ruled China in the Yuan dynasty between 1279 until 1368. And the Manchu entered China and ruled China in the Qing dynasty between 1644 and 1911. So it's just to show that even though there is a lot of costs here, and in this case even in terms of lives that were taken to build the wall, it did not prevent people to enter China in this specific example. And Dudley Poston has even some other studies showing that several other walls around the world did not work. So the case of the China's Great Wall here is one example of several that he points out for other countries around the world. In terms of the visa overstayers, most of the people entering the US nowadays and become undocumented are visa overstayers. Those that enter the country with tourist visa, they technically are allowed to stay between 3 and 6 months, but then they overstay their visas. So a biometric entry-exit system would monitor people entering and exiting the US. And of course, it would reduce the number of visa overstayers because the US government would be able to kind of track the people who entered legally in the country, documented with, for example, tourist visas, but then they overstay. But if there was this biometric entry-exit system, it would monitor people entering and getting out of the country. So actually the Congress mandated an electronic entry and exit system more than 20 years ago, but it has not been implemented because of objections from the tourist industry and other groups, because this industry and other groups think that by having this biometric system, it will prevent tourists to come to the US because they don't want to be monitored this way. So because of this lobby, this system has not been implemented in the country. The third reason that Dudley Post and Peter Morrison mentioned that the southern border wall will not work is related to the selectivity of migration. So only the strongest and most advantaged people attempt crossing the southern border. A wall, of course, will make the journey to the US more dangerous. Many migrants will fail, many of them will probably die trying to cross the border, but eventually most of them will succeed. A wall will cause immigrants to settle and stay in the US and not return to their home countries. So Douglas Massey and his co-authors, they mentioned that exactly because of an increase in the security in the southern border in previous decades, immigrants, they would come to the US, work for a while, and then they would go back to their home countries. If we increase even more the security in the southern border, these immigrants, they will keep coming, they will succeed entering the US because they are more advantaged and they are really want to come into the US. And once they succeed and come here, they will stay here. They will settle and stay in the US and they will not return to their home countries. So usually these policies, they have the counter effect of intended. And just going a little further on these studies by Douglas Massey and his colleagues, and he mentions about the surge in border enforcement after 1986, exactly because of the immigration reform, the IRCA in 1986. And I mentioned before, millions of immigrants that were undocumented, they gained a legal status, but in that reform also, it was an agreement among politicians that they should increase border enforcement. So there was like this huge increase in border enforcement after that, that immigration reform. So it was a massive policy intervention undertaken for domestic political purposes, but it was not based on analysis of the forces driving migration. Politicians did not go in depth trying to understand why these people were coming to the US, exactly because of socioeconomic differences between Latin American countries and the US, and because of possibilities of people improving their lives by coming to the US. So politicians, pundits, and bureaucrats continue to call for more border enforcement even today, even after 1996, when the American government increased all this border enforcement, and people kept coming, and instead of going back to their home country, they would stay, they would settle in the US. And even after that policy not working as intended, still all these people continue to call for more border enforcement. However, since 2008, net undocumented migration has been zero or negative, so it's much more related to political purposes than actually based on data of immigration to the country. Because policies are usually not based on evidence, are not based on data analysis. Even when policies respond to changes in immigration, they are usually not based on understanding the driving forces of international migration. These policies are usually shaped by economic circumstances, political ideologies, and symbolic significance of immigrants, presented by the media, politicians, and legislators. So these policies, these immigration policies, they might respond to some changes in immigration data, but most of the data, the evidence, the empirical evidence, the driving forces of international migration are not analyzed by all these people implementing these policies. So it's much more related to perceptions, so through the symbolic significance of immigrants, through ideology, than on real data. And because of that, the US policy has been really contradictory in terms of immigration. So restriction on work permits turn legal migrants into unauthorized migrants. And we saw that that happened even after the Bracero program. In the Bracero program that terminated in 1968, before that, people would enter, Mexicans would enter the country with temporary visas or temporary permits to work here. But after 1968, they could not work as temporary workers anymore. They would enter as undocumented immigrants. And in 1986, with the immigration reform being implemented, okay, a lot of undocumented immigrants received the legal status, but because of increases in border enforcement, people would not be likely to enter with documents, so they kept coming and they would enter without documents. So exactly because of this increasing border enforcement and so on, politicians would expect that would decline undocumented immigration. However, family preference systems prevail, which encourage non-workers to migrate. So what happens is that in the past, a lot of immigrants would come here to the US with temporary legal permits, work for a while, usually more male workers, and then they would go back to their home country. But now, since it's much harder to come in, the whole family comes in and they stay in the country. So major findings of this research shows that increasing border controls affect the behavior of unauthorized migration from Mexico. Border enforcement discourage circularity. So people or male workers tended to come to the US, work for a while, and then they would go back to Mexico. So we have a circular migration. People come in, but then they would go back after a while. But since border enforcement increases so much and you don't have more temporary legal programs such as the Bracero program, this increasing border enforcement at the end of these temporary programs, people, when they enter the US, they don't go back again. So undocumented immigrants are encouraged to stay. So in the past, we had a circular flow of male workers going mostly to 3 states, California, Texas, and Illinois. So you'd have male workers coming to the US, border enforcement was not so harsh, and then after 1986, after the immigration reform, with increases in border enforcement, these people stopped to have this circular flow, because before, male workers would come by themselves, work here for a while, mostly in these 3 states that had the highest rates, and then they would go back to their home country, in this case, Mexico. And now, because of an increase in border enforcement, you have the whole family coming into the US and stay in the US, because border enforcement is so increased so much right now, it's more difficult to come in, but when people come in, they stay. And they're not coming only the male workers, but all members of the family. So it changed from the circular flow of male workers to 11 million people living in settled families throughout the nation. So now it's not just male workers coming and working in specific states and going back to Mexico. Now it's the full family, all members of the family coming to the US, entering and not going back, and settling in all different states in the United States. And here it's a map to show the share of unauthorized immigrants as a share of foreign-born by state. So you see that you have high percentage of undocumented immigrants as a share of, I'm talking here only of the foreign-born population, so the foreign-born population is the denominator of this rate. and the numerator is the number of undocumented immigrants. So this right here shows the states that have the highest shares of undocumented immigrants out of the foreign-born population. And just to show that the circular migration that we had before, that you have temporary migrants coming usually to Texas and California, for example, now these people start to go into all these different states across the country. So they spread all over the country exactly because border enforcement now is so hard that once they enter, they stay with their whole family and they move to all different states in the United States. Another topic that's discussed in these articles here by Dudley Poston and Peter Morrison is that actually the people who enter without inspections, they don't take jobs from the US-born population. So EWIs don't take jobs from US-born Americans. Almost all EWIs perform work that Americans don't want to do. There is little evidence that EWIs harm or suppress the employment or wages of local people. And I include several extra readings in the course website, and in the next section of this lecture here, I will talk a little bit more about this, so you can take a look at these extra readings and also the next slides, but there is little evidence that EWIs harm or suppress the employment or wages of local people. And what is important too, about half of EWIs of this specific group of undocumented immigrants, they pay taxes. In 2015, for example, the IRS received more than 4 million tax returns from workers without Social Security numbers, and many of them are EWIs. They paid almost $24 billion in income taxes, and they are not eligible. They won't get any of it back in Social Security or Medicare payments. So they are paying all this money to the American government, and they are not getting back from any of these government programs. So the data shows exactly the opposite of all this discourse that we tend to hear on the media from specific outlets and also from specific politicians. And another thing is that foreign-born people have considerably lower crime rates than do the US-born population. And we saw that in a graph before based on a survey implemented by the Pew Research Center. So and also what's interesting to highlight is that most illicit drugs don't enter the US via the EWIs. Most drugs smuggled into the US do not arrive on the backs of those who cross undocumented. In 2015, for example, the US Drug Enforcement Administration reported that Mexican drug cartels bring most drugs over the southern border through ports of entry via trucks, passenger vehicles, and tractor trailers. So undocumented immigrants are not the ones bringing drugs to the US. This is done through the regular ports of entry in the country that require visas. And as we saw before, as I mentioned before, the first generation immigrants, they have lower crime rates than the native-born population, than the US-born population. The second generation immigrants, those that are born in the US and have parents born outside, then they start to have crime rates that are more comparable, the same level as the US-born population. But the foreign-born, lower crime rates. So then whenever we look at real data, we have a better understanding of what those undocumented immigrants are. So that's the discussion that I had to talk about in this specific subtopic of the chapter about international migration. Thank you very much.